A date which will live in infamy.
Both of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerechtbare Brüder in Amerika, so tausend Shabbos, es gibt
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be Cantors.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Jewish History Soundbites podcast, and we'll talk a little bit about the golden age of Chazzanus in the early part of the 20th century, and especially its main player, Yossele Rosenblatt, the most beloved and perhaps the most talented of the great Chazzanim, maybe ever, for sure in the golden age, and a little bit about his life, and perhaps I'll be able to get to touch on a few of the other great Chazzanim of that time period. The golden age of Chazzanus is a description of the first half of the 20th century, and there's quite a few reasons why that was the golden age, although lately there's been some sort of resurgence of Chazzanus, which is why it reminded me of it, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit. But the golden age produced a large amount of Chazzanim and a lot of large and rich shuls across Europe and in the New York area in the United States, and even across the United States at the time were willing to pay pretty much any price for the glory and honor and prestige of having their shul being graced by one of the famous cantors of the age. So Yossele Rosenblatt, who to a certain extent has come to define that era, who is not only a fantastic chazan, but also was a great composer, and that's an additional reason why he was considered one of the greatest, is because of his many compositions and not just his actual voice and capabilities. And many of his classics are sung till today, both by Chazanim and by laymen. It's some of them are quite popular. And he grows up in the Ukraine in a very religious home. His father's a chazan, and at a young age he moves with his family to Sadiger, and with the encouragement of the Sadiger Rebbe, his father becomes a traveling chazan through the large cities of Galicia, Lvov, Chernovitz, Krakow, and his son Yossele is, as a child, already accompanying his father places. And during Yossele's Sheva Brachas, he signs a contract with the Munkach Jewish community, which is not far from the area that he had been living at the time, to become a chazan there. It doesn't last very long. He doesn't like the atmosphere of Munkach. He feels it's too stifling. The Jewish community is a bit too conservative. And even though he not only was Orthodox, but remained very Orthodox, very religious, very frum for the rest of his life, but he wanted a little bit more of a musical freedom. And he moves on. He gets a position in Pressburg, which he very much loved, and the shul there hired him. Pressburg also offered him the opportunity to be near Vienna, which was the center of music, the center of European music and culture. Excuse me. And he got a lot of practice and lessons and exposure to the world of music, to the world of the opera, and techniques, different styles, more modern styles, and which he incorporated into his chazanas, into his davening, wherever he was. He later was a chazzan also in Hamburg, and he eventually took up a position in New York. And his first position actually was in Harlem, which sounds funny, but Harlem actually in Manhattan had a very large and prestigious Jewish community for quite a bit of time, and a shul called Evokes, which eventually relocated to the Manhattan's Upper West Side, which I believe is a shul that still exists today, though I'm not sure how much of a relation it has to the original Evokes, which was of Hungarian origin, which was related to where he originated from, and he became one of the highest paid Chazzanim in the world. He was very famous at this point, and he renegotiated his contract with the shul several times. He needed a certain amount of freedom to do his concerts, to go across America, and he even went back to Europe on a few tours of both Western and Eastern Europe at different points in his career. And the problem is that not only did he have a large family, he was married and eventually had 8 kids, and he lived a bit of a high life, but also he spent his money quicker than he could make it, both on, like I said, his lifestyle, but in addition to that, both on his charitable acts. He had a tremendous heart, and he loved the Jewish people, and he did a large amount of chesed, and for sick people, and for needy, and for different organizations, and he was always looking for the betterment of Jewish society, both in America and back in Europe and in Eretz Yisrael. He was a Zionist, and he believed in a lot of what the Zionist movement was building, and he had a tremendous support for that. Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich once proposed to him that they invest together in a religious newspaper. In New York at the time, the main Jewish newspapers were Yiddish papers put out by Jewish socialist, Bundists, Maskilim we would call them, and the Forwards and other newspapers. That was the Yiddish press, and Rav Shraga Feivel wanted to combat that with a religious paper, and he found a willing partner in Yossele Rosenblatt, who wanted to further Yiddishkeit in America as well, and he invested a huge amount of money for the time. I think about either a little more, a little less than around approximately $100,000, which at the time was an enormous amount of money, of his own funding as a business investment, and the venture went bankrupt, and he lost all his initial investment. And that's just one project, but many, many other projects that failed. He wasn't a great investor. He invested in general in other business propositions that were not necessarily connected to charitable ventures, and he tended to lose his money there. So he was always short of funding, and he always was hounded by debts and debtors, and even at one point was forced to declare bankruptcy. And he declared bankruptcy, but he, being an honest Yashara person, wanted to pay back his debts down to the last penny, despite the fact that he had bankruptcy protection. So he was always looking for better positions as a chazan in different shuls, and he came back to Evokes several times. And in addition to that, he went on these tours across America, twice back to Europe. When he went to Eastern Europe, to Warsaw, Lodz, places like that, Lublin, Vilna, the crowds literally filled up the streets and tried breaking down the doors to the shul to get into him. He was so popular. He was literally the most popular chazan at the time. He was pretty much the first one to record his own chazanish pieces on a phonograph, the invention of Thomas Edison, and he utilized that new invention to market himself, and that popularized him even more. So much so that the opera heard of him, and they wanted to hire him to sing for the opera. Now, he admired the music of the opera and the artistic of the opera, and he sometimes would sing opera pieces at Chazzanish concerts, but he did not want to sing for the opera. He said, I'm a religious Jew, and I'm a chazan. I'm a Bal Tefillah. I stand in front of the Amud, and I represent the tzibur, the mashliach tzibur. I'm a representative of the tzibur to daven to Hashem. And someone like that, it's inappropriate to sing for the opera. That was his own decision, and he gave up an enormous amount of money To give you an example of at the time how much money he was making $10,000 a year at his Chazzanus position in the shul. In addition to the concerts he was doing, brought in another few $1,000s. And the opera was offering him a run of 17, a full season of 17 appearances. Each appearance, he would receive $1,000. So he would receive $17,000 just from the opera, and he refused it. He turned it down because of his values. That, by the way, made him even more popular amongst the people when they heard about that. He was offered a acting position in Hollywood for a movie that was to be made that would need a chazzan cantor service by Warner Brothers in the 1920s, and he refused that as well. He said a chazzan is not an actor. He did agree to go down to Hollywood to record a piece of Chazzanus, but not to act in the movie, just to record it. They would use his voice. And when he was in Hollywood at the time, he actually met the famous Hollywood actor, the most famous of the Hollywood actor of the silent era of the 1920s, Charlie Chaplin, the great comedian, great slapstick comedian of that period of time in Hollywood. And the two of them met. And Charlie Chaplin actually allegedly told him, it's hard to know if this actually happened, that whenever he feels down, he feels depressed, he listens to some of Yossele's music and it lifts his spirits. And interestingly enough, one of Yossele's famous pieces is the classic Shir HaMalos that pretty much everyone sings at their Shabbos table. I'm going to spare you all, and I'm not going to sing it, but all of you know what the famous Shir HaMalos is. That's Yossele's tune, and that everyone sings, so much so that it was even considered being used as the tune to sing to the words of Hatikva, which would have eventually become the State of Israel's national anthem. He was a Zionist, he was connected to the movement, and it was a very popular song, and very beautiful song, and they were going to use it. So the religious Jews of today can be thankful that they did not use his Shir HaMalos song for Hatikva, because this enables them to continue to sing it for Shir HaMalos, and it would have caused some of them a bit of a discomfort to have to sing the same tune as what's sung for Hatikva. So that was narrowly avoided. Now, he wanted to settle in Israel eventually. He didn't know if he was ready, but he had an offer, which is initially a financial offer, which is why he came. But once he came to visit Israel, he fell in love with the place. He had an offer to create a documentary about Israel. So he arrives in the summer of 1933. He stays there for several months, and he decides he eventually wants to settle there. He's just going to do another tour of Europe and perhaps South Africa to make some more money, pay off his last debts, and then come back to settle in Israel permanently. He literally was electrified by the atmosphere there, by both the old Yerushalayim and by the new settlements and the farming and agricultural areas. He got very close with Rav Kook. He would spend Shabbos afternoons with Rav Kook. He would learn with him. He would sing there. He wanted to stay. So he's doing this film in the meantime, and then he's going to head over to Europe. And his last tefillah, public tefillah, was davening in the Churva Shul in the old city of Yerushalayim on Shabbos. That was his farewell tefillah before he would come back shortly to settle in Israel, as was his plan. His plan never came to fruition. This was on Shabbos, and on the end of that Shabbos, he gives his personal Sefer Torah to Rav Kook. He said, I usually carry it with me, but this is going to be anyways my last tour in Europe. I'm going to be coming back soon, so I'm depositing it with you. Rav Kook puts it in the Churva Shul to wait for him. And the next day, on Sunday, which happened to be the day of the funeral of Chaim Elazarov, the famous Zionist leader who had been assassinated on Friday, 2 days earlier, which is a story in itself, which perhaps I'll have the opportunity to talk about at a different time. And he, on that day, goes down and does filming for this video, this documentary that he's making and being paid to make about the Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael, both the ancient and the new. So he goes down to Chevron, to Marsa Machpelah, to Kever Rachel, where he sings about Kol Barama Nishma, that Rachel Imenu, and he goes down to Yerichai, and he's at the Jordan River and at the Yam HaMelach, and he is doing all the filming. And at the Yam HaMelach, he started not to feel well. When time he got back to Yerushalayim, he was really breathing heavily, not feeling well. His wife calls a doctor, and the doctor checks him out. And in the course of the examination, the doctor asks him, well, how old are you? And he says in one of his most famous classic songs at the time was Rachem No. At every concert that he would make, people would demand that he sings Rachem No. And he says, don't you know, Dr. Rachem No? And No is Gematria 51, Nun Aleph, and I'm 51 years old. And the doctor said, it doesn't seem like he's doing well, you need to have him rest, you need to give him liquids, you need to do this, you need to do that. And the doctor leaves. A couple hours later, he was dead. It was quite sudden. He had been so full of life. He had sung that day, and his wife was in shock. They made a levaya for him the next day in Yerushalayim. Rav Kook was maspid. He's buried on Har HaZeisim. He never got to finish his tours, and he actually did never leave Eretz Yisrael, which was sort of his dream. And he eventually not only lived there, but died there and got buried there in his kevers on Har HaZeisim. Interestingly enough, one of the most other famous Chazzanim of that time, who continued many years past that, was a Chazan by the name of Moyshe Koussevitzky. And later, shortly afterwards, they asked him if he's the second Yossele, and he says, no, I'm Yossele the third. And he says, why? They asked him, why are you the third? And he says, because there's no one second to Yossele. I could be maybe the third. And Moyshe Koussevitzky himself had grown up in the Litvische town of Smargon and became a chazan at quite a young age in Vilna, in the choral synagogue in Vilna, which today, when I bring groups to Vilna, to Lithuania, it's actually the last shul, the only shul that still exists in Vilna. It was more of a progressive shul, and today it's the only shul. It's the minyan 3 times a day, and it sits in the heart of the old Jewish quarter of Vilna. Big, beautiful shul. It's a central part of any visit I do with the groups. And Moyshe Koussevitzky was a chazan there. He's upgraded shortly to the great synagogue of Vilna, which unfortunately doesn't exist. There's archaeological work being done in the area, and they've discovered the mikveh in the basement of the area, which was the shul. Very famous shul, the Beis Knesset HaGadol of Vilna. Has a lot of famous stories attached to it, the Chafetz Chaim, the Vilna Gaon, even earlier. And Moyshe Koussevitzky is the chazan of the great synagogue of Vilna, and then he's upgraded to probably the greatest position in Eastern Europe, maybe in all of Europe, maybe in all of the world, the great synagogue of Warsaw. Warsaw being the center of Jewish life of the pre-war era, and Moyshe Koussevitzky is the chazan in the great synagogue of Warsaw on Talamechki Street, and that's where he remains until the war breaks out. He actually had taken over the previous chazan, Gershon Sirota, who was the chazan in the great synagogue in Talamechki Street. And Gershon Sirota was kind of fired because the shul felt that he was taking too much time off to do concerts across Europe. So he leaves. He stays in Warsaw, ironically, and becomes the chazan of another major shul in Warsaw, the Noizhik synagogue. The Noizhik was a drop more to the right of the great synagogue in Warsaw. Wasn't exactly a Heimish shtibel, but it was a firmer shul. And today, the Noizhik shul is the only and last and the only remaining shul in Warsaw. Big, beautiful shul, a central part of any visit I do with groups to Warsaw. It's a beautiful shul. It's the only place that you can really tell the story of Jewish pre-war Warsaw. It's an active shul, 3 minyanim a day, mostly of tourists, but the few Jews who are still left in Warsaw also. And it's definitely a major stop on all our visits to Poland, the Noizhik shul. So Moyshe Koussevitzky, Gershon Sirota becomes a chazan there for a period of time. Gershon Sirota, by the way, stays in Warsaw through the Warsaw ghetto and is a chazan in the Warsaw ghetto, in an underground shul, in a courtyard in Warsaw. And the stirring davening that he davened of the Yomim Neroim, the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur of 1942 is remembered by the few survivors and people who recorded it. They said the songs that he sang then were different than the songs that he had ever sung before. And Gershon Sirota, unfortunately, was killed together with his wife during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But back to Moyshe Koussevitzky, he escapes at the beginning of the war from Warsaw into the Soviet Union, survives the war in the Soviet Union, and comes back to Warsaw at the end of after the war. Now imagine, he didn't live through the Warsaw Ghetto. He left. He was the chazan of the great synagogue on Talamechki Street. The great synagogue on Talamechki Street was blown up in a symbolic destruction. They planted dynamite there, the Nazis, and General Jürgen Stroop, the SS general who crushed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He wanted to symbolically show the end of the Warsaw Jewish community, and at the end of the Warsaw Uprising, he blew up the great synagogue of Warsaw on Talomachki Street and said, and wrote in the caption of that picture, "The Warsaw Jewish Quarter is no more." So this whole Warsaw goes up in flames. There's no one left. There's nothing left. And Moyshe Koussevitzky, who had stood at the top of Warsaw society, comes back and sees the devastation, sees the destruction. And in a very moving ceremony, when Rav Herzog, the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, was visiting the Sheiris HaPleit of the survivors in Poland, he was one of the only ones who had actually come down to Poland to visit. There were other big rabbis and Jewish leaders who went to Germany to displaced persons camps following the war to visit survivors. But Rav Herzog went not only there, but he also went to Poland, and he tried to give them chizuk to the broken survivors who were trying to piece together their lives at that time. And they're in the ceremony that for Rav Herzog and in his honor, Moyshe Koussevitzky, who had just returned from the Soviet Union, sang a kilmole and said Kaddish, Lili Nishmas, all the people who had been killed. And that whole ceremony was filmed. And I saw it, and it's one of the most moving pieces that I ever saw. And of him singing there, mourning over Jewish Warsaw, and this small group of survivors, and Rav Herzog there. And there's the great chazzan Moyshe Koussevitzky singing and saying Kelmole for all those who had passed on from the Warsaw that was no more. And Koussevitzky moves on to America, becomes the chazzan in Beit El Synagogue in Borough Park, and lives there till the 1960s, I believe, maybe even the 70s. I'm not sure. And he, excuse me, 1966. He passes away, and he is a big chazan in America, and so much so that I spoke to people who grew up davening in the Mir Minyan in Borough Park, which is obviously a much more yeshivish minyan in Borough Park. But on Shabbos and Mevarchim, sometimes they would sneak away without their parents knowing, or for sure without their Rosh Yeshiva knowing, and they would go to the more modern shul to go hear the great Moyshe Koussevitzky sing right there in Borough Park. So that's a little bit about the Chazanim of that time. This is Yehuda Geber. You can reach me at ygebss@gmail.com for questions, comments, sources, or to arrange tours to see some of these great places. You can subscribe now to Jewish History Soundbites on iTunes, Google Play, or Spotify. Don't miss an episode of the podcasts. If you enjoy, give a good rating, share it with your friends and family. You can follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.